Pawb. It's lovely to see everybody here today and that so many of you have been able to join us, and particularly to be talking about such an important topic today. It's actually a topic that I was planning to touch on last week when I was supposed to be speaking at the Forestry conference in London, but unfortunately was really sick instead and so didn't make it. So I'm delighted that I'm able to come along for today. So this is the second Forestry Knowledge Exchange event that a Welsh Government has hosted in 2024, and we're planning actually to continue these throughout 2025 with a series of events and workshops, both virtual and live. So I'm really delighted that today we're joined by speakers from Forest Research, Edinburgh Napier University, Bangor's Biocomposite Centre, Com4 Nursery Producers Group, Wood Knowledge Wales and Natural Resources Wales. So fantastic lineup. And I'm not going to say anything more because I know that you're all itching to get into the detail and hear from all our fantastic speakers today. So it's my absolute pleasure to hand over now to Tom Jenkins, Head of Forest Research in Wales. And Tom will introduce this hugely important topic for today's session, the future productive species selection and timber properties. So Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Naomi. Hopefully everyone can see my screen at the moment. As Naomi says, this is the second in a series of knowledge exchange events for the forestry sector, being organised by Welsh Government and Forest Research in this instance. So thank you to Gail and David and colleagues for organising this afternoon's event and for pulling together what looks like a really interesting and relevant programme of speakers. It's my impression that discussions around forestry, particularly in the news and on social media, increasingly focus on conservation and biodiversity to the apparent exclusion of many other benefits delivered to society by well-managed, productive woodlands. So this afternoon's knowledge exchange event will hopefully serve to redress the balance a bit by covering topics that directly relate to the industrial timber sector, for want of a better description. So I thought I'd start with some figures to back up the importance of the topics being covered this afternoon. So the first of these is that the UK was the second largest importer globally by value of wood products in 2023, just behind China. And you can see here that 6.2 million cubic meters of sawn wood was imported, 3.1 million cubic meters of wood-based panels, 6.4 million tons of wood pellets, 4.8 million tons of pulp and paper, with a total value of just in excess of £9 billion. I've put on each slide some QR codes, so if you're interested in following this up, the QR code should take you to the relevant pages online to look at. Okay, so these are the bald figures for the UK. But as forestry is a devolved responsibility, how is this shortfall being addressed through forestry policy in Wales? Well, Chapter 5 of the Woodlands for Wales strategy focuses on the importance of Wales having a competitive and sustainable forestry sector. And the latest version of the strategy, which was published in 2018, estimated that the forestry sector in Wales made an annual contribution to the national economy of over 528 million and directly employed between 8,500 and 11,300 people. And you can see here that I picked out from the Woodlands for Wales strategy, Chapter 5, just 3 of the key points. That more timber is grown, processed and used in Wales, that the forest sector remains competitive and sustainable, supporting the Welsh economy, and increased use of timber as a key renewable resource. A study published by Forest Research in 2017, and hopefully soon to be repeated, gave indicative total annual values of 3 non-market benefits delivered by Welsh forests. providing further evidence of the importance of well-managed productive forests in Wales. And you can see here that air quality improvement, which is delivered more by conifers and broadleaves, was by far the largest contribution. Getting back to today's presentation, the careful selection of future productive species and the consideration of timber properties, and that is the right trees properly managed in the right places for the best end users, will be crucial for the delivery of a competitive and sustainable forest sector in Wales. This course of action should increase the resilience of Welsh woodlands to both abiotic and biotic threats, whilst also maximising the out-of-forest benefits that are delivered. So we'll be maximising, hopefully, the delivery of ecosystem services in the light of climate change, increasing opportunities for adding value to forest products grown in Wales, and underpinning the socio-economic well-being of current and future generations. The FL website, just to do a shameless plug, it contains a myriad of information that we hope is of direct use to the sector, and works underway to update and develop the website to make it usable by a wider audience than previously. Our aim is to deliver high quality, up-to-date and unbiased information of operational relevance in more accessible and easier to digest formats. Phase 1 of this went live at 9:30 this morning, and further improvements will be introduced shortly, so watch this space. So the website, as of 9 o'clock this morning, looked like this, and as of 9:30 this morning, is a little bit brighter, and coincidentally showcases some news and featured content that is of direct relevance to today's event. So this is the first in many visible improvements to come, so please watch this space. So I'll hand over now back to Gail for the remainder of what I'm really looking forward to as a great afternoon of information and hopefully discussion as well.
Thank you very much, Tom, for that introduction. That's wonderful. So our next speaker is David Edwards, who's going to share with us information about the work that Scottish-led work that Forest Research have done recently on this topic of future productive species selection. So over to you. Thank you, David.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Gail, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Edwards. I'm from the Chief Scientist's Office in Forest Research. I work very closely with Chris Quine, the Chief Scientist, who many of you, I'm sure, will have come across. I'm going to describe a piece of work which we've carried out for Scottish Forestry, which could potentially have relevance for Wales as well. And to start us off, I'm just going to take us to the very beginning and take stock of all the risks and threats that forestry is facing at the moment. We'll all be familiar with these 6 images on the screen here. These represent wind throw, fire, pests and diseases, drought, frost, and flooding. And it seems that our forests are increasingly at threat from these risks. And furthermore, there are compound effects. Often these act together, and many of us will have watched with some alarm the situation in Central Europe or parts of Central Europe, where we have a combination of increased temperature, drought, wind throw, all exacerbating the risk from certain pests and diseases, in particular Ips typographus on Norway spruce, and devastating large areas of forest over there. So there are obviously very real risks that we're all concerned about, and increasingly we all acknowledge that it's necessary to increase the resilience of our forests and to act preemptively, as well as to respond and recover after events have happened. So within Forest Research, one of the things that we've done is develop what we call the Adaptation Practice Guide. adapting forest and woodland to manage for a changing climate. Now, this is a guidance document that we published a couple of years ago. It underpins the UKFS, so it's official guidance that's been very carefully reviewed and sort of scrutinized before publication. So if you haven't seen this, please do download it from our website. It presents basically 10 different measures that the forestry sector could pursue to try and increase the resilience of our forests for those 6 risks that I mentioned in the previous slide. So it includes increasing species diversity and structural diversity. It includes using natural generation where that's appropriate, so that we can start benefiting from the natural adaptive potential of forests to a changing climate. It includes measures such as thinning and planning and biosecurity and so on. So it's a really nice resource, which I would definitely recommend anyone has a look at. And you can see in the top left-hand corner, that's the cover. And also, just building on what Tom Jenkins has said, we have a climate change hub, which is part of the FR website. It's hosted on the FR website, which acts as a kind of one-stop shop for guidance and information to do with climate change adaptation, and in the future, hopefully also climate change mitigation. So there's lots of case studies and resources and links to additional resources which you can access, as well as that guide itself. So what I'm going to talk about today builds on this need to increase resilience, and in particular the need to diversify the range of species that we use in Britain. So I've been working with Scottish Forestry over the last year on a piece of work that has involved about 30 different researchers from across the FR and a great many stakeholders as well. And that's what I'm going to describe later. But just to give you a little bit of policy context for that, Scottish Forestry are in the process of developing, and they're about to publish, a strategic action plan for resilience. And they have a cross-sectoral steering group that oversees that work, which has agreed on 3 priorities: planning, knowledge exchange, and species choice and silviculture. And it's the third of those that I'm going to talk about today, species choice in particular, because one of the key actions in this emerging plan, which is probably going to be published in the new year, one of the key actions is to develop a short list of species, productive species, both broadleaves and conifers, that we can use to diversify our forests, that the whole forestry sector in Scotland can commit to. And the idea is, at the moment, there's a kind of scattergun effect where different parts of the sector have their own short lists and different lists of priority species. And there's a kind of fragmentation, and we need to really join things up and consider what exactly are the species that we should be focusing on throughout the whole sector, right from tree improvement and plant and seed supply at one end to make sure that we've got the material to plant the trees, through to silvicultural research, knowledge exchange and training, also to guide which pests and diseases we should be focusing on in our surveillance activity. And perhaps most importantly, at the processing end of the forestry wood chain, to make sure that we're all focusing on a short list of species so that over the years we can start building the processing capacity and the end markets to make sure that all the trees that we're planting are going to have a use at the end of the day. So this shortlist is of some strategic importance, and hopefully it will really help bring the sector together. And it will lead to a whole load of actions. And some of those, for example, might be increased grants levels to make sure that there are the incentives in place to really scale up some of those species on the shortlist and make sure that there's a critical mass available so that processing actually makes sense. So that's the background to what I've been doing in Scotland. And just to sort of jump the gun a little bit, I'll mention that we've been considering with DEFRA, with England and Wales, and potentially also Northern Ireland, to potentially run a similar exercise in the other countries, so that there is a kind of synergy at UK level. Each country might have its own list, but at UK level, there'll be synergies where we can look across all these lists and we can see which species crop up in all of them, and where are the actions which are perhaps best done at UK level to really make sure that diversification happens in practice. So I'm going to launch in now and describe what we've done in Scotland, and then because none of this is completely set in stone, it's all still a work in progress in Scotland, there's still time to change things. So I'm always interested to hear feedback, comments, suggestions, which we can still take on board. So to start us off, Scottish Forestry gave us a long list of species that they wanted us to assess. And most of them are on the screen here. First, there are the principal species, which are already well known in forestry on the left-hand side. Then there's a selection of so-called secondary species, which have potential, but are slightly less well known. And then there's a few more as well. There are 4 natives, which didn't already appear in the previous slide. And some so-called plot stage species, which, again, they're not really well tested, but they're showing real potential. One of those, in particular, Macedonian pine, might well be one that we're considering seriously. So if you could imagine a matrix, we have all these species down the left-hand side, and then along the top, we have some criteria that we'll be using to assess all these species, and that's what these are. So these were developed following a workshop that Scottish Forestry and Forest Research organised in September last year. About 50 stakeholders were there, and we asked everybody, what should the criteria be to prioritise the different species? And this is what we effectively came up with. So I'm going to go through each of these very quickly, just to give you a flavour of what we measured and what we didn't measure. So I'll start with tree improvement. So Richard Whittiett, who leads on tree breeding for Forest Research, did most of this work. He scored every species on the list against all these different attributes: provenance information, what we know about the feasibility of selection, of testing, of breeding, effectiveness of mass deployment, and then the impact that tree improvement would have in the real world in terms of financial return. He also took into account whether the next step for each species in a kind of tree improvement pathway should be just a very extensive approach where you are really just identifying the best plus trees and developing seed stands, or whether a more intensive approach was appropriate for the really good performing species where it was worth the effort and the cost to really do a proper tree breeding program. So he came up with a series of scores for each species, and you can see those on the screen here. Now, we don't have time to analyze it properly, but just to point out, you can see that Sitka and Scots pine are at the top there with the greatest potential. Surprisingly, Sitka, despite many years of tree improvement, still has great potential for further improvement. And then there's a group of species after that, which you can see there, which are still well worth thorough investment and so on down the list. So that was tree improvement. The next criterion we used to assess each species was plant and seed supply. And what we did here, we again scored all these different attributes for each species. And we put the greatest weighting on seed supply itself, because If you can't get the seed, then obviously there are going to be concerns about rolling that species out if we were to put it on the shortlist. But we also took into account all the other factors that you see listed there to do with the seed, handling the seed, and also nursery production, whether there are any issues which might hold us back. There weren't many problems. We didn't really feel that there were many species where the sector probably couldn't adapt if we did indeed decide to shortlist that species. The third criterion, excuse me, was silviculture. So we assessed how much we know about each species because it would be risky to roll out and really increase production on a large scale of species that we don't know much about. So we assess what we know about them. We also assess their establishment rate because that, and also the ease of establishment because that's an important part of the overall financial return. And at the bottom there, you can see 4 so-called supporting attributes. So these were attributes where we felt we can provide information on them, but we don't want to score them because it's not necessarily good or bad, for example, whether shade tolerance is a good thing. You know, what we really want at the end of the day is a palette of species, some of which are shade tolerant, some of which are light demanding, so that we've got species that can cope with a full range of silvicultural systems and site types. Palatability and squirrel damage were indeed something that we would want to score, but we didn't think that the data was strong enough for us to really sort of score them and include them in the matrix, which I'm going to show you at the end. But we collected data on all of this. So the next attribute is site and climate suitability. In other words, does the species actually grow in Scotland? Does it grow now, and will it grow in 2080 according to the modelling that you can do using ESC, Ecological Site Classification, the tool that FR has delivered? And also at the bottom there, again, some so-called supporting attributes on frost, drought, wind, and fire for major abiotic risks. So this was quite an interesting analysis on its own, because, for example, it showed that noble fir, for example, really appears to be decreasing in the area over which it's suitable. So it makes you think twice about whether it ought to be included on the shortlist. There's a lot more I could say about that. In the end, we have included it most likely, and that's because noble fir is one of the few species that is suited to the kinds of sites where Sitka grows, poor upland exposed sites. And so perhaps it does have a place on the shortlist. Next category was productivity. We assessed the yield class that each species has. And we also assessed carbon sequestration as a kind of supporting attribute. Tree health, obviously very important. We assessed separately, we have assessed and scored the pest and pathogen risk both now and in the future, and aggregated that into a single score for each species. Now, this was particularly important because quite a few species have been ruled out as a result of tree health risks. So most of the exotic pines, for example, because of the risk of strains of Dothystroma entering the country and affecting Scots pine, but also, not surprisingly, ash and larch species as well. The 7th one, biodiversity and environmental impacts. We developed an index. This was Nadia Barsoum, who's presenting later in the event today. We came up with a score that assesses the contribution of each species to woodland ecological condition, which is an established measure based on the National Forest Inventory in Britain. Only a few of the attributes included in the WEC approach were really relevant to species choice per se. So we homed in on those and also have been providing some commentary against those to make sure we really take into account some of the nuances. For example, there's a big concern about invasiveness of some of the exotic conifers. So we needed to make sure that that was taken into account. Also, a few other negative environmental impacts were assessed as well. So finally, and not least, wood properties and end use. So there are two slides on this, two central aggregated measures. Now this is based on the work from Dan Ridley Ellis, who's speaking later today. He did a genuinely fantastic job of assessing all those species against a whole range of different factors and aggregated it into two scores, which Dan, in the questions at the end, I'm sure would be able to provide more information on if there's interest. But those two scores were firstly, the technical potential of the wood, which was focusing on those four different factors that you see there. Now, an interesting one there is the so-called minimum Sitka index. In other words, how similar is the wood of each species to Sitka? Because, of course, a large part of the processing sector in construction want material that's similar to Sitka. So that was weighted quite importantly in the overall index. And the other measure that Dan put together was the compatibility with the current wood value chain. In other words, is there a market for it? And why not? And all those many factors there were used to create an index which assessed whether that was the case. Now, of course, that's very important, but it isn't necessarily a factor that we should use to completely rule out many species, because there is the idea that over the coming decades, if we were to roll out some of these species, then there is time for the processing sector to adapt and respond accordingly. But nevertheless, it's an important factor. So those were the various criteria and attributes, and that's all summarized here on this table. You see on the left-hand side, there are the 8 criteria. In the middle, there are the 10 attributes, the so-called definitive attributes, which we scored. And we put all those scores on the same 4-point scale so that we could compare them all. And I'll show you the matrix in a second. And then on the final column on the right, there are the so-called supporting attributes, which provided a lot of extra data, which we should be taking into account when we get to the stage of scrutinizing a potential shortlist to make sure that we've got a full range of species that can cope with different silvicultural situations, site types, and so on. Now, what I want to do now is show you what happens when you bring all that together. So we just very simply in Excel created a tool to assess all the species, focusing at first on those definitive attributes, the 10 measurable attributes that you see along the top there. And down the left-hand side, you've got all the species that I showed you at the beginning. And if you go down, the list continues further down to the bottom. Now, what you see in that red row where it says weighting, there's a 1 in each of those columns there. So if you were to weight each of those attributes equally, then over on the right-hand side, that's what the ranked list of species looks like. So you've got silver birch, Sitka spruce, Scots pine, western hemlock, and so on. Now, the key message that I want to put across is that there's no right answer, that it really depends on the weighting that you choose. So, for example, if you felt that yield class is by far the most important thing, far more than anything else, You see at the moment there's a 1 in the cell below yield class. If you were to change that to 10, over on the right-hand side, you get a different rank list of species. So Sitka still at the top, or near the top, then Western hemlock, Douglas fir, and so on. Many of the species stay pretty much in the same place, but there are differences further down. If you were to say that pests and diseases should have a score of 10, then you get a very different list indeed. Sitka is quite a way down as a result of, mainly because of its typographers. So there's no right answer, and we've used this as a tool in a workshop in NRS in Scotland with 50 stakeholders to just explore the data and see what different weightings we all feel comfortable with and what effect the different weightings have on the shortlist, which was a very useful exercise. But what's really important to highlight is that this whole approach can only take you so far. What you also need to do is bring in all that secondary data, some of which is there, which I mentioned earlier, on all the different attributes which haven't been scored in a formal sense. And also, just you need to look at it in a qualitative way. And what we're doing at the moment is assembling a bit of commentary on each of those cells, or most of them, just to expand a bit and help interpret what those scores mean, so that we can really understand whether or not they matter and what the real detail is. So that's what I'm doing at the moment for Scottish Forestry. We're trying to just add some commentary and help interpret the scores and help start forming a short list. So we have a short list, which is very provisional, which we've proposed to the steering group in Scotland. And we're in the process of really scrutinizing it and testing it out on different people with different perspectives on the whole subject. And hopefully probably in February, we'll end up with an established list that we're sufficiently happy with to publish, or rather for Scottish Forestry to publish. So that is the overall approach, and I'm sorry I'm not able to show you the provisional shortlist because it's a little bit premature. We haven't yet tested it out enough to feel confident to communicate it, but just to say there are not many major surprises. A lot of the species are going to be ones that we know already, that we're very familiar with, partly for that reason that I mentioned earlier, that there are risks in promoting species that we hardly know. But what this whole exercise does is provide a common evidence base that we can all scrutinize together, and it's all comparable and comprehensive, so that we can look at the issues faced by plant and seed supply, for example, alongside the issues faced by the processing industry, and it joins up that very fragmented conversation that we're having at the moment about how to progress the whole diversification agenda. So, as I say, it's possible that we might, we're in discussion with DEFRA, Welsh Government, and possibly later with Northern Ireland about doing a similar exercise in each country, all overseen by a new steering group, which is at UK level, which is led by DEFRA, chaired by Geraint Richards, who many of you all know, key figure in the forestry sector, who, among many other things, will be looking at the prospect of extending this exercise to the UK level. So before I finish, I wanted to just highlight that this is the work of a good 30 people across FR, and acknowledgements to all of them for their many inputs, plus many stakeholders, mainly in Scotland, who've contributed to this process. As I say, it's not done and dusted, so if there are any questions and feedback, very keen to hear those. when we get to the question and answer slot later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. That was a great overview. If people do have any questions, please put them in the chat. And we're going to hand over now to Ben Go from Mailer Forest Nurseries, who's representing Con4 Nurseries Producers Group. So Ben, over to you.
Okay, can you see my screen? Is it being shared? Excellent. Okay, well, I need to go and have a look at it. Right, so thank you, Gail, for inviting us, and thanks for the speakers beforehand. So I'm here to give a little insight, I suppose, to the life that productive species have before they get planted out in a forest. It's the more interesting backstory, I would say. But it's around things like origin, provenance, selection and trials, and obviously the propagation and growing of those crops. So hopefully I can provide a perspective which is useful, a useful input into the kind of exercise which David talked through, and useful input to the overall strategy. So just by way of introduction, so my name is Ben Go. I'm from the commercial manager at Mailer Forest Nurseries, but I'm here today speaking on behalf of the Con4 Nursery Producers Group. So the Nursery Producers Group represents exactly 13 forest nurseries across Great Britain, who in turn grow about 75% of the trees which are planted in the UK, and that's in the private and public sector, where those trees are planted. But those forest nurseries are just in the private sector. So it's a group of progressive nurseries. We focus on knowledge sharing, really pushing things forward, more so now than ever, really, because the challenges facing nurseries are coming thick and fast. And also there's a focus on promoting UK grown stock with good traceability. So yes, so those nurseries, I think geographic distribution, I think about 7 of them are in England, maybe 5, 6 are in Scotland, 5 in Scotland, and then ourselves in Wales. So just talking about Mailer Forest Nurseries. So we're part of the Binderholz Group, which owns the BSW Group. So our sister companies, we recently merged with Till Hill, and our sister companies include, for example, the BSW sawmills, BSW Timber, Scott Pallets, and other companies there. We grow a wide range of species. I didn't include the list in this presentation, but it's about the species list is split about evenly between broadleaves and conifers. Most of, if not all of those species which were on David's primary or principal species list are on there, and a good chunk of the secondary and plot trial species are on there as well. We do bare root and cell grown production, increasing amounts of cell grown, which I'll come on to a little bit later. And we do a lot of research into different provenances, different propagation techniques, crop protection techniques, treatment techniques. We have a number of seed orchards on the site, and that image on the right-hand side is our Orchard 22 Sitka seed orchard. I'll come back to that a little bit because it's quite a relevant image. So we do a lot of seed collection from our seed orchards, and also seed collection from sort of all across Great Britain for native species, for example, and process it on site and grow it. We have quite a strong focus on provenance, whether that be for native provenance or whether that be for productive species. One silver birch is not the same as another silver birch in terms of either suitability or productivity for a given site. We're members of the Conifer Breeding Cooperative, who are currently working on the improvement of Sitka spruce, Douglas fir, Norway spruce, and Scots pine. And a couple of our accreditations there. So just before I sort of launch into the presentation, a couple of baseline points which I think is important to make from the point of view of general nursery production. And those are that our production cycles are quite long. Currently we're planning our spring sowing, which will include stock, which will be a 1-year crop that will go out at the end of 2025. And there will also be some longer sort of growing cycles. Macedonian pine was mentioned by the previous speaker. That's usually a 4-year crop. You might get it as a 3-year crop. So that would be going out in 2029, potentially spring 2029. So we're looking quite far ahead. And once we put it in the ground on the nursery, that is, the cycle has started. So decisions around species choices, around volumes are quite important, but often made without a firm commitment from a customer. And also stock it's a perishable crop effectively. So whilst you may be able to stand over certain crops for a year, if you've grown it, if you've put it in the ground in spring, 2025, it really has to go out when it has to go out. So matching supply and demand can be very tricky. Now, I said I'd come back a little bit to this seed orchard here. That was a bit more background about it. That was planted in between 2009 and 2013, and it took about 10 years to come into production. So for a productive species, that seed orchard is the result of quite extensive and intensive, tree breeding, which started several decades before, but crucially gives us the outputs from that tree breeding, which is improved seed. And that's necessary to achieve volume as well as the gains and the traits that we're trying to achieve. So across the UK, I had a quick look at the register of forest reproductive material this morning. There's about 60 seed orchards, and they are generally all focused on the principal species, which David listed. So there's about a dozen Sitka orchards, a handful of, I think, Scots, lodgepole, Corsican pine, some larch seed orchards, a few silver birch seed orchards, some cherry orchards. But the point that I wanted to make is if we want to be able to deploy productive species with high productivity, then this is one of the milestones, a seed orchard that you probably need to go through if you want to maximize the productivity of that species. And that is a big investment and takes a long time. So what species should we be growing? And David's covered quite a lot of this, but I wanted to address it from the point of view of a nursery, because this is the number one question which is asked by ourselves of customers and by customers of us. And I can only conclude from that nobody really knows the answer to it, which is why I'm very excited about the exercise which we're going through, this webinar, because hopefully we can get an answer to that. But in the absence of a clear consensus or an agreed strategy on that, the nursery has to blink first, I suppose, because we have to put the seed in the ground and grow something. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg, but by making that choice, we do have an impact on what is ultimately planted, because if we don't put it in the ground, it's not planted. So I've kind of split species into mainstream and alternative for want of better definitions, but people will be familiar with these sort of arguments falling on each side. And then, of course, there are arguments which can kind of push your choice to either way. Site being very important in terms of location or topography, or whether you're in Scotland or in Wales, up a hill, down a hill, but also in terms of landscape considerations, planning considerations, and many other factors. So it's not a one size fits all, certainly, but hopefully you can define your choice of species mix on a macro scale, which is enough to get nurseries going, because we don't grow for individual sites, we grow for the market. So hopefully we can define that species mix. It needs to balance all those objectives, and it's not as binary or as polar as that. Obviously, you know, those factors both play both ways, and it will evolve over time. As I said, we grow for Great Britain. You know, pretty much all the nursery supply all across Great Britain. So we need to have an idea of the global mix of requirements. Obviously, you know, individual requirements will shuffle back and forth. But that forward visibility is critical to ensure that it's there when we need it. So some of the nursery considerations, and I put in a changing climate because, as I alluded to, that is a big, that is steering quite a lot of the way that we do things, as well as what we do. What we do, I suppose, is driven by considerations of, you know, what species should be planted, which will be suitable for growing in today's conditions, 2050, 2080 conditions. But how we grow it is dictated by what's happening on the ground at the moment, to a large degree. So if we start with a specification for trees, and that's at its simplest, it might be species, provenance, size, and format. We would then have I suppose if you like, a protocol, a recipe card, a prescription for how we would grow that tree that's required. And it takes into account seed properties, seed availability, seed provenance, you know, how that seed needs to be pre-treated in order to promote germination, what the germination factors are, and hence how much space you need for it. The crop cycle, is it a 1 year, 2 year? Is it going to be transplanted or undercut? I won't go through all these, but just to pick on a few of them. How much water is required? In bare root, outdoor growing, that we can irrigate, but there's no substitute for precipitation. So that is something which we need to consider in light of changing weather patterns. Growing format, that might be bare root, it might be cell grown. Crop protection and nutrition is quite an interesting one. One of the main issues that we face is competition from weeds. And what we've certainly seen is the growing season for weeds and weed competition has increased. Wetter springs, wetter winters, sort of longer, warmer temperatures extending into spring and winter just mean a longer weed growing season, and that can have implications for the success of trees. I haven't talked about transport, but that's quite an interesting one. I mean, we deliver trees for most of our customers, and there was a lot of work done on the handling, correct handling and transport of trees, but a lot of that work was done probably a few decades ago, where even as recently as that, the climate was markedly different. A lot of our bare root trees are going out in the winter, when a couple of decades ago, you know, you could rely on fairly low temperatures, whereas now, you know, recent weeks have demonstrated that, you know, we could have prolonged periods of warm weather when we should be, or when we'd historically be sending trees out, storing them on site, and under these warmer conditions, they'll start to wake up again, and that has a big impact on establishment. So one of the things that we're looking at is, you know, increased cold chain transport of trees, not uncommon in many other sectors, but something which we need to switch across to in the live tree sector. So, if you like, those are what the crop needs, what the crop would like. There's a whole range of external factors which dictate what the crop actually gets, and we're nothing if not pragmatic in the nursery sector. So we're very mindful of those and react necessarily to those where we have to. So demand, you know, we might plan, as I said, for 3 years from now, I don't know, 1 million of a certain tree, when in fact we have an outbreak of a disease such as a Phytophthora pluvialis, which affected Western hemlock and Douglas demand for a couple of years quite significantly. The crop was already in the ground. The current climate, the weather conditions we get, we're seeing increasing floods, as you know, during the winter when normally we'd be lifting bare root crops, cooler summers, droughts, they can all affect us very significantly on the nursery. Innovation is, you know, we're always on the lookout for different ways of doing things, because what is at stake is quite significant. So we do take advantage of what new technologies are available on the market, skills and labor. I don't need to go into that too much, but as we're looking at new technologies, obviously we need to upskill for those. The availability of the various consumables which we require, transport provisions. The future climate, when we're investing in infrastructure, we need to think about what conditions we'll be growing in, regulation, chemicals available for herbicides, for example, for battling weeds or fungicides, and pests and pathogens affect us on the nursery, not as much as, but have the potential to, in different ways, affect what we're growing. So we talk about resilience in the forest, but for us on the nursery, we need to address those internal and external factors. And as we have a changing species mix, we need new protocols, and they will react differently to the external factors we face. So can we, with that rather kind of somber and complicated outlook, can we actually grow stock? I'm conscious of time, so I'll very briefly jump through this. So what you can see on the right-hand side there is what we refer to as our mini plug facility. And that was commissioned in 2022 and crucially allows us to control the growing conditions which we have, which gives us that quality and consistency and addresses some of those externalities and sort of fluctuations which we might see. It's got a high degree of automation and resource efficiency, uses a lot less water, a lot less chemicals, and it has quite a significant capacity if we, you know, if we're to sort of use it all year round. It's only really for seedling germination and growth up to about 10 centimeters, after which we would transplant it either out into the field or into plugs to grow onto a full-size tree, somewhere in the region of 20 to 60 centimeters for sending out and planting. I just wanted to go through a very quick exercise in answer to that question of can we grow it? And that's to pose a question, which is, and these are completely arbitrary, it's an arbitrary scenario, but I thought it was useful for the comparison. So if primary consumption of timber products in Wales is about 3 million cubic meters, and I'm happy to share my workings afterwards on that, and our current inventory can supply, our current forest inventory can supply 50% of that, then the question is, can we meet the need, that other 50%, in terms of numbers, and can we, you know, do we have the knowledge and the capability to grow them? So if we translated that into species, then you'll see that there's differences for each species, and that's what I'm talking about here when I really say that how many trees you need to plant on the nursery, not in the forest, is a function of things like germination and production factors, obviously the yield class to grow how many million meters cubed of timber, and what your inventory and end users are. So we look at a high yield, and when I say yield, I'm talking about yield class in its traditional sense. I'm also talking about yield per seed on the nursery, if you like, and that's really a function of germination and survival factors on the nursery. So Sitka would have a germination factor somewhere in the mid-90s, survival factors somewhere in the 90s, and then yield class. I dropped a mark somewhere in mid Wales using the ESC model, and that's what these yield classes are using. So the mini plugs facility could produce about 38% of that requirement to fill that 50% gap. Other species, medium yield species, for example, improved Norway, Douglas, Scots, Western red cedar, somewhere in the region of a fifth. When we move on to other species, so things like hemlock, coastal redwood, some of the ABs, Macedonian pine, then we're down into 6 to 10%. So the point I wanted to make is there's quite a big difference, not just in what you have to plant in the forest, but what you have to plant in the nursery and the achievability of that. I've just put a little star here, which is to talk about the yield class of Sitka. I think ESC kicked out about 26. What that doesn't recognize is that whilst the yield class in meters cubed per hectare is high, actually one of the focuses in breeding on Sitka has been around form and density. So in terms of conversion of those meters cubed into sawn timber, that's actually higher than it would be for other species. So can we grow it? Yes, kind of. Right, I'll whiz through these. So hopefully I've covered them all. So future productive species mix needs careful consideration, as Tom said. But there are a lot of other considerations beyond just a species mix. Improvement through breeding can offset a loss of productive area. It's also important to recognize that diversification of species and alternative species, as it stands at the moment, will yield less in the forest and will certainly yield less in the nursery. But it's not just about faster growth. It's about ensuring that we get what we need in terms of outputs ultimately. One important point to make is you might logically say, well, then let's start improving as many species as we can. Just to give you a very rough figure, you need a budget of somewhere in the region of £1 million a year, and that's a sustained budget because tree breeding is a long-term sustained activity. About £1 million a year per species for intensive breeding. So it's not something which we can feasibly commit to. Not me personally, maybe somebody else can, but you need to select a finite list of species to improve. And finally, a list of some of the steps which need to be taken on alternative species. Crucially, we need some visibility about what those might be. So thank you very much. I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Ben. That was fascinating. So we've got a quick 5 minutes for questions before Dr. Nadia Barsoom's presentation. So I'm going to ask Anne just to look at the chat and to raise any questions that have come through the chat, please.
Yep, we have a question from Mel Meaden, NLW, and it's for David, which I think has just rejoined us. So David, has the future productive species selection been considered for a farm setting, for example, farm woodlands, or is it just for the commercial forestry sector? And I think it was Tom who has kindly put in the chat the tree species guide, excuse me, that was launched a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, that's partly the answer, actually. Tom Jenkins has put that link in from the agroforestry guide that assesses a long list of species. Not really is the short answer. I think what we're focusing on for the work at the moment in Scotland is productive species which are going to be grown at scale in a more traditional way, although increasingly, hopefully, in more diverse silvicultural systems. There's a possibility we might include short rotation coppice species, but that's a sort of not the main focus of it all. Although arguably the approach that we've used is one that could be extended to farm forestry, so there might be scope to integrate what we've done with what Alice has been doing for agroforestry.
That's it. There's no other questions, Gail, but Professor John Healy has just put a link in the chat, which is Wood Knowledge Wales's paper, I think from 2021, top 5 alternative conifer tree species review. So.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you very much to the first speakers. If there's no further questions just now, I'm sure people will think of questions later. If we could just move on then to the next presentation. So we have Dr. Nadia Barsoom from Forest Research. Thank you.
Hi, hopefully that's sharing okay.
It's not full screen at the moment, Nadia.
It's not full screen, okay. I was worried that might happen.
You have a very nice background, though.
Yeah. Oh, why is it not full screen?
That's a bit better.
A bit better, but it's a little bit. Is it mostly full?
If you go to display settings, but doesn't that do it in the top?
You're showing us the presentation.
You go, it should give you a couple of
Yeah.
options. There we go. Does that help? If you've got two screens in your office.
Yes, I
maybe.
do.
If you
Yeah.
swap presenter view and slideshow, does that do it?
Okay.
That looks
That's
better.
it.
Is that it? Okay. Good. I'll go ahead then. Yeah, so thank you very much for the invitation to come along today and present. I'm Nadia Barsoum. I'm a senior forest ecologist at Forest Research, based at the Alice Holt Research Centre in Surrey. So I was asked to have to give a little bit of an overview of a publication that came out a couple of months ago called the Rapid Review of Evidence on Biodiversity in Great Britain's Commercial Forests. So I was going to talk mostly about the review, give you a little bit of an overview of what's in it, but also some work that sort of stemmed from the review. So that's been inspired by sort of gaps in evidence that we found, and so I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So I just wanted to acknowledge my co-authors here on this publication. Alice Broom was contributing on elements about woodland specialist species, Joan Cottrell, and then also Elsa Field, a former PhD student of mine who did a lot of the literature review grunt work, a lot of filing through literature on biodiversity in commercial forests. And so this review basically has two parts. If you have a look, you will see that there's a part which is really focusing on predicting whether woodland specialist species are likely to occur in commercial forests. And this is considering habitat requirements of individual specialist species. And then the second part of the review is sort of a classic literature review, having a look at what sort of evidence is in published research out there, reporting on biodiversity in commercial forests, and then there's some analysis there as well. So we had to restrict ourselves to certain tree species. We couldn't cover all possible tree species that are being used in commercial forests in Great Britain. So you can see the list there of our conifer species from Sitka spruce down to Douglas fir. And then we had 5 broadleaf species, birch, oak, beech, sycamore, and ash that we included. And these are all, we chose these as really very common commercial tree species. And the birch is not typically a commercial tree species, but it's very commonly found within commercial forest stands. You can see the sort of the bottom graph there. There's a sort of a spike going up, the green spike going up, which is birch climbing in terms of its forest area. A lot of birch is sort of left in conifer stands as a sort of an element to improve biodiversity. So we thought we should include the birch as well. So just to go through the first part of the review, this was focusing, as I mentioned, on the knowledge-based predictions for woodland specialists. So we had two goals here. One was to compile our list of woodland specialist species, and then to use expert knowledge of their habitat requirements and to assess whether a commercial high forest has the potential to offer suitable habitat. And then a second aim was to actually look in the literature that we were already collecting for part 2, to just see if we could see evidence of any of these woodland specialist species actually being mentioned as being present in some of those studies in commercial that are based in commercial forests. So in total, we had 444 woodland specialist species that made up our list. That's obviously it's not a comprehensive list of all possible woodland specialist species, but these ones we derived from basically publications that were signposting these either vascular plants, epiphytic lichens, and so on as actually known woodland specialists. So we use these various references: Rose for the vascular plants, Coppens and Coppens for epiphytic lichens. Alice Broom had already a list of woodland specialist bird species to hand. And then the Joint Nature Conservation Committee has a sort of a signposting list as well of certain woodland specialist species that we used. So overall, you can sort of see we tried to cover a range of taxonomic groups, and then you have there in the table the number of species that we considered as woodland specialists for each of those taxonomic groups that were assessed. And the way we went about the assessment was just we had basically looking through research articles to have a look at the habitat requirements of each of those 444 species, any conservation guidance and compilations of expert knowledge, could be web pages, could be all sorts. And so a typical example here, you've got the green shield moss as one of our woodland specialist species. A typical entry that we would put down is information that says something about, well, it's typically liking a large fallen deadwood of these tree species: Scots pine, oak, alder. It likes to be in humid sites, often associated with rivers and watercourses and ravines. And then we had a look at typical sort of commercial forest stand level, and if some of those habitats are present within the forest stand. But then we also had another look at sort of a second assessment at the whole commercial forest stand level. So sorry, beyond the stand level to the whole forest, because we recognize that you do have features in the wider landscape that some of these woodland specialist species would be quite happy to use, but maybe not at the stand level. So some of those other features we considered were open areas, rides, forest edges. You could also have ponds and seepages, typically rocks and rock faces, which would be very suitable habitat for some of the woodland specialists. So the way we went about, so as I mentioned, we looked at any reports, actual reports of occurrence from the literature, and also any negative associations that were mentioned in any of the evidence that we gathered. We did consider all the life stages of the species that were considered. So even if it was just the very early life stages that used commercial forests, we considered that was enough to include it as a user of commercial forests. And then just to point out with it, we also, for some of the species, we did, consider that some have very restricted ranges, which might be a reason for not occurring or occurring in only certain areas. And an example of that is this moth, the lunar yellow underwing, which it has a preference for tussocky grassland in the larval stages, but then the mature stages might be occurring in the mature woodland. And also it has quite a limited distribution in Great Britain. So some of the results, we have here a table that shows you at the forest stand what our predictions on the forest stand level, and then at the whole forest level for each of these different taxonomic groups. So this is in percentage terms. So if you look at the first row there for birds, 58% of our woodland specialist species we predicted to occur in that they probably have the habitat requirements satisfied in forest stands, commercial forest stands. If you go wider to the whole forest level, at 66% of the woodland specialist species. For mammals, next row down, you have 29% at the forest stand level would have their habitat requirements satisfied. But if you look at the whole forest level with all those other types of microhabitats, it climbs to 86%. Some of the species, taxonomic groups that were not doing so well, probably in commercial forests, according to our predictions, were lichens, mosses, liverworts, tending to need lots of light, and also undisturbed environments over long periods of time. So only 14% predicted at the forest stand level, and 19% at the whole forest level. And here we have a table of what we predicted and then what we actually found in the literature as reported sightings of the woodland specialist species. So again, I'll just talk you through this. I mean, this is just a very quick overview. You can have a look at the report, has a lot of this in it. But the birds at the top row there, the prediction was that we had 9 of our woodland specialist species would be present out of the 24 that we looked at. And actually, we found a higher number were reported, 22 out of the 24. So that was a bit of a surprise. As far as fungi, we predicted at the bottom row there, 5 of the fungi that we were predicting to occur. We only found one incidence of it being actually reported out of 35 specialist species. Just a couple of slides as a sort of there is a caveat with the woodland specialist work that I wanted to point out, is that when we were doing the woodland specialist work, it was considering all forest types as one, rather than considering them as really quite separate types of habitat that have their own unique features. So that's an important caveat to keep in mind, that you maybe it's you have more of those woodland specialists occurring in beech, for example, than the Sitka spruce, but we didn't take those differences into account, and that also is the case when it comes to the different life stages of a commercial forest, pre-thicket through to over mature stages. There are obviously lots of differences between those, but again, we just considered commercial forest stand as one type. So just to keep that in mind. The part 2 I mentioned is the literature review and analysis, and we had 3 goals there. One was to use a systematic literature approach to looking at peer-reviewed literature, and this is looking at basically any of the anything we could find on biodiversity reported in commercial high forests in Great Britain. The second aim was to summarize all of those biodiversity studies and then highlight gaps in our understanding. And then also finally to just check if what is the likelihood that we could actually conduct a full systematic review considering the collated literature, because we had about a 3-month period to collate literature, so it wasn't a full complete deep dive. It was as much as we could in that period of time, and we for systematic review, you're really answering a specific research question. So we wanted to see, could we, with the amount of literature that we have managed to uncover. In terms of the literature that we were looking at, we had a couple of criteria for what we would accept or exclude. So what we included were any studies that were direct measures, that showed direct measures of species community. So that could include things like identification via DNA or soundscapes. All of the studies needed to be GB based only. So we didn't really want studies from North America or Europe, and even Northern Ireland we excluded. Commercial forests studies that were comparisons between commercial forests and some other habitat type were included. That was fine. Commercial different crop type pairwise comparisons we included. And then we also thought, well, we're including any type of silvicultural system. So whether it's continuous cover forestry or clear fell type of system, we included those studies. What we did exclude was any kinds of studies that were using surrogate measures for biodiversity. So that means that, if deadwood was supposed to represent potential for biodiversity, we didn't include those kinds of studies. We didn't include coppice or short rotation forests. We were only concentrating on high forests. So studies reporting on those types. Excluded the pests, diseases, viruses, algae, any references to those. Any review studies, we were really after the empirical studies in their own right and what they were reporting. And aquatic species we also excluded. So here we have a search terms which should be fully repeatable. And we have started off with, just to show you how it worked, and starting off with about 3,000 publications. We had to sift through that to remove all those that, based on the criteria I've just shown you, and came down to about 142 separate pieces of research that we could look through to see what evidence there is. And this gives you sort of an overview for the different commercial tree species that we were including in our review. In terms of, in blue, the blue histogram shows you the number of studies by tree species, and then the gray shows you the relative proportion of those tree species in Great Britain. So Sitka spruce, you could see looks like it's understudied. Ash and larch would be also understudied, and sycamore compared to the amount of those tree species around, and that may be related to the fact that for the ash and the larch that there's a disease element there that might mean that there's less interest in carrying out biodiversity research on those species. And there's a couple of maps that we've included in the publication that just show you give you a quick overview of where the different studies have been conducted. So this is a map of the forests in the UK, the green, and then where all of these biodiversity studies have generally been carried out. Lots of Thetford Forest, obviously quite heavily. All the areas where you have dense patches of woodland, then that's where you might expect to see some of those studies, but there are underrepresented areas. So the southwest of Great Britain, area around Cumbria was pretty empty in terms of numbers of studies. And we also had some maps just based on different taxonomic groups, so you get a bit of an impression of where certain studies by taxonomic group have occurred. We have a bit of a gap there for Wales for a few of them. Few of those taxonomic groups, and here's for arthropods and vascular plants. Just a very generalized overview here of you can see birds quite heavily studied in all of the number of studies that we came across. Above ground invertebrates would be next, and then the least studied, maybe not surprisingly, the soil invertebrates and fungi is more tricky to have a look at. And it doesn't make a difference which tree species. Generally the trend is the same. So the birds across the board were the most intensely studied taxonomic group. Above ground invertebrates next, and then again soil invertebrates not featuring in the majority of the cases. I just wanted to point out yes, there's a lot of above ground invertebrates. However, if we look a little bit closer, a lot of those above ground invertebrates actually are only a large proportion are road beetles, ground beetles that have been trapped in pitfall traps as a very easy method to survey arthropods above ground. So that's a little bit of a misconception if you think, oh yes, there's plenty of arthropod studies, but actually it's quite limited to specific groups. In terms of species survey methods, the majority, 72%, is based on morphology. And other methods of detecting species were much, very limited number of studies. So molecular DNA techniques, only about 3% of all studies. Sound, radio tracking, also not very high. I mean, I do think that if we reran this in 5-10 years' time, that would be a very different story on this histogram. Molecular DNA techniques are increasing rapidly in many of the studies, and opening up the world to see a little bit more of some of those the hidden majority, the arthropods out there, and certainly helping us to unravel the biodiversity in Britain's forests. So in terms of next steps beyond the review, this is we're aiming to publish it, and we're aiming to publish the sort of an online interactive search database where you could plug in the tree species of interest, and then you could have a look at where different studies have been conducted and of different taxonomic groups. Another step that we're taking is on the left there, you have the we have the list of species that we've already had a look at in terms of a review, but we've included this past year many more species, emerging tree species, to have a look at again in the literature to see if there is any evidence in terms of biodiversity associated with them in Britain. So that list is sort of the extended list that we've been looking at. On the right, I just added in a couple more species that I think kind of fell off the list, but I think maybe in the next round we'll try to include. So wild cherry and alder, chestnut haven't made it in, but I think are really quite important species in the commercial sector. So, and finally, as I've said, other projects also have come from the evidence review, and one is called Biodiversity Across Forest Types, which just started this year. and that's being led by myself and Sophie de Beckfor or at Forest Research. This is a project which is quite an ambitious project, but we want to have a look at different biodiversity in different forest types across Britain using standardized methods of data collection. What we found in the evidence review is that it was really hard to try to unravel what the differences are between different forest types because of very different methods of data collection or the time from when one surveyor has collected data and another. So in this project, we want to have a look, and these sort of symbols show representing different forest types. We want to cover the geographical range for these different forest types. We also want to try for some of the forest types, not all of them, to have a look at what happens if you manage them in one way or the other, if it's a mixture or if it's a monoculture as well, and how does that then impact on the biodiversity? Again, using standardized data collection methods. The platform for this research, the ambition is to use the National Forest Inventory. We have 15,000 sample squares in Scotland, England, and Wales that we can use to 1 hectare. These are 1 hectare squares that we know a lot about in terms of what the composition of the stands are over 3 cycles of NFI now. So this will help us to identify squares that we can potentially carry out our data collection. One of the first jobs is defining the forest types that we're going to be looking at, and we can't do them all, so we have to have a short list, and that is we're looking at looking at 8 to 12 forest types at the most. We're not just doing the commercial forest stands; we're including semi-natural forests as well. And so the idea is that we were going to be selecting NFI sample squares that are samples and that are representative examples of forest types across UK geoclimatic regions, and with sufficient replication that we can really draw some robust conclusions. So part of the defining of forest types means that we are looking at tree species. We've decided to focus on tree species that are dominant tree species in canopies across Great Britain, whether it's commercial forests or whether it's native forests. We're only focusing on those dominant tree species. And then we are categorizing those tree species according to life traits that have an influence on biodiversity. So whether they're whether they cast a lot of shade or don't cast a lot of shade, whether they provide fleshy fruits, and various other aspects and traits that are important for biodiversity. So here for conifer as an example, we basically split the conifers into 5 groups. So you've got pines as the low tolerance to shade as one group. Group 2, that's typically the spruces in there. I won't go through the whole list, but then you've got the larches that are deciduous, obviously very different, not low shade casting. Juniper and the yew at the bottom there, they produce fleshy fruits, and they have associations with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, so they're really quite different in terms of the conditions that you would find in those types of forests or where there's a predominance of those trees. So 2 phases to the project. The first phase is this year, and we are not going out and collecting any data yet, but what we are using is data that is already existing within the National Forest Inventory, which is 15 woodland ecological condition indicators. They're not all listed here, but these are examples of each of those indicators that are sort of proxy measures of biodiversity. So once we have our representative NFI forest types, then we're going to have a look at these WEC indicators according to forest types and have a look at whether one forest type has greater WEC score than another forest type. And then the next phase, starting from next financial year, the plan is then to go and have a look at actually collecting standardized data from these different forest types, looking at basically answering these questions: what biodiversity is supported by these different forest types in Great Britain? What's the influence of forest management on forest-associated taxa? And the plan is to do similar collection to what we were doing in another project, which is covering really quite many different strata within the forest, audio moss for bats, We've got canopy traps for arthropods and some malleus traps also for arthropods in the subcanopy. And we're also looking at soil biodiversity. A lot of DNA techniques used in trying to collect data for species. And so finally, the idea is that we start to be able to understand the differences between our different forest types, for example, the one on the left and on the right, and how our communities are shaped and how the interactions between species. That's the potential. That's the dream going forward. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nadia. We have got some questions for you in the chat, but I'm aware you've got to leave now. So with your permission, what we'll do is we'll forward those questions to you for you to answer, and then we'll get the responses back to the people who've asked the questions afterwards. Is that all right?
I have about 5 minutes, but otherwise I do need to run. I've got a school run.
Right. Okay. Well, Anne, shall we pitch in and see how far we get then? Thank you.
Sorry, excuse me, and then we'll have a short comfort break. So, so Jacob Middleton has asked, in order to see future planting of climate-resistant species, as mentioned, do you predict significant changes to the current UKFS allowance of planting 60% single species? And what percentage would you suggest of any single species? Long question, sorry.
What percentage? I think that's a bit controversial. I think there's already suggestions of what that should be. So I don't know.
Do you want me to just do you predict significant changes to the current UKFS? Yeah, so I mean, maybe there is, like you say, that's quite a specific question. I don't know if you want to give that some thought, and I can move on to the other two. I'm just conscious of time, just so you're aware what they are. We've got another question come in as well. So Gary Newman has asked about, do you have anything to say on biodiversity changes with changing life stage of a forest stand? And would you be looking at this in the future? It seems of critical importance in a commercial context.
Yes, I think that there have been quite a few studies in the past that have looked at this sort of a chronosequence. And yes, it is vitally important because obviously the habitat changes dramatically over time. We decided that we cannot tackle that within this biodiversity across forest types project. That's just one step too far. But there is quite a bit that's one area that has been studied a fair bit in the past. And at Forest Research, we did have a large project in the late 1990s that was chronosequences. That this is within commercial forest stands that was looking at chronosequence and how does biodiversity change across the chronosequence.
There's a quick question here from Johnny Hulson. How did you choose the sites? So that was quite a late question, so I think that relates to your few slides just before the end, I would say, on the sites that you're looking to.
So our sites are essentially, it's the forest. We were looking for our forest types define what we're looking for in terms of the NFI sample squares. We have criteria that we're not going to use sample squares that have a lot of edge to them, so they have to be really embedded within a forest, or that have lots of gaps in them, like a road going through it or something like that. We also we're trying to select across the geographical range of that forest type, so that we're covering where it occurs and be representative, so that we're not just looking at one little corner of the country. Those are some of the criteria.
Okay, great. And I'm just really conscious of time, but I just wanted to let you know of another question, which may be a sort of request rather than a question, from Ted Wilson. Can the future research work be linked to the Forest Development Types project published recently by FR?
Yes, it is linked to that. The forest development types, we decided not to go with that, the full list, because it's a very long list of forest types. So we've had to reduce down and this is very much with a head on for biodiversity and what is influencing biodiversity. So I mentioned we selected the forest types and used life traits that are we expect to influence biodiversity, such as the amount of shade cast or the amount of whether a tree has berries and those sorts of things.
Great, that's it, Gail.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful. Thanks, Nadia. So
Thank
we're going to
you.
have a very, very quick comfort break now before the next presentation, which is Dr. Dan Ridley-Ellis. So if it's all right, Dan, I'll let people go now for a very quick comfort break, but please only make it 3 or 4 minutes and be back on as soon as possible. Thank you. Okay, well, I hope everyone's had a quick chance to have a bit of a comfort break, and if you're ready to come back now, that would be great. So our next speaker is Dr. Dan Ridley Ellis from Edinburgh Napier University. Are you there online, Dan?
I am, yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes, thanks. Over to you.
Good. My computer just announced that it was too busy to start Teams properly, so apologies, I had to duck out and come back in. That was just to reset everything.
Your computer needed a comfort break. That's
exactly
done now.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll try and catch up a bit of time if I can, but I'm going to be talking about the properties and processing, alternative species in the value chain, picking up a bit on what was said already at the beginning of the webinar. So I'm from Edinburgh Napier University. We've been working in the area of wood properties for some 20 years, but I should say that this is not just an Edinburgh Napier University thing. I must give very high credit to Forest Research, not just because we couldn't have done anything that we've done over the last 20 years without the aid of Forest Research, but also because they've been very influential in the stuff that I'm about to talk about, particularly Elspeth MacDonald, who did start the process of collecting this information about the properties and potential of the different alternative species, and I took over from Elspeth after she'd already done quite a lot of work. So there are a bunch of different properties that matter depending on what you want to do with the wood. Certainly, if you want to make anything like a building or a piece of furniture, then you are concerned about properties like strength. Strength is describing how much force it takes to break a piece of material. There are many different concepts of strength. The one that's usually used in wood products is the kind of strength that comes from the bending test. Putting a force on bending the wood and just reporting how much force is required to break it. So when I'm talking about strength from here on, mostly I'm going to be talking about bending strength. You're always worried about low strengths rather than average strengths. So to get a good understanding of the possibility of low strength pieces in the resource, you have to test a lot of material. And that explains why we need a lot of data and why I shall be quite arm-wavy about some of the properties. Other property that matters, particularly for our resource, it seems, is the stiffness, and stiffness is describing how much the wood bends or stretches under a particular load. So that would govern how bouncy your floors are and things like that. And the other one is density, which is very important property for fire performance and also for capacity of nails and screws and so on. So they are the three main properties for construction and for several other products as well. But that's just three of many. There are properties like hardness. If you're going to make flooring or furniture, you'd be concerned about how easy it is to make indentations in the wood, how easy it is to scratch it. You might be concerned about natural durability or ability to treat it with preservatives. You might be concerned about how easy it is to split, or how do you need to pre-drill before you put fasteners in? Will it accidentally split? Do you need to concern yourself with distortion, with changes in moisture content, color, the appearance, the creep, the workability, a whole bunch of different things. But one thing to bear in mind is that there is no such thing as high quality wood. There is always the application in mind. So we can only talk about quality when we have a context for that. So one thing that might be good for one kind of product might not be good for another kind. So when we talk about quality, it should always be bearing in mind that this is a function of both the properties and the purpose. And the other thing to bear in mind is that often we use certain proxies as indicators of quality. So, for example, for strength, we might consider knots to be a quality indicator because we might think that knots, presence of knots, means low strength. But actually, it's strength that we're concerned about. And if strength is good, even if there are knots there, that doesn't mean that we should get rid of it simply because there are knots, unless knots are a quality indicator in their own right. So we have various needs in society for wood. I already talked about construction timber. It's top of my list because we work with it, but also because it's important for building safety. It's also the one that's most highly regulated and controlled, and the one in which you need the highest certainty of data. Pallets and packaging are also super important. So is fencing. All of these also important for construction. You can't build anything without pallets and packaging or fencing. Also board products, also very important for construction. A lot of board products in modern timber frame houses. We use a lot of wood for furniture, flooring, joinery, paper and cardboard, of course, energy, of course, and a lot of important markets for the co-products, not just the sawdust, but bark and so on, and numerous other things. And any species that we plant has to provide several of these, because for the system to be economic, there has to be this basket of products. You have to be producing lots of different things because you can't turn a tree entirely into construction timber or entirely into furniture. Now, we have a particular way of using the word species in wood products, and it's quite different from the way that a botanist or a forester would probably use the word species. And I dropped a link in the chat with a bit more information about what we mean when we talk about species. But it is anyway something that we don't totally separate away from growth conditions, because both of those things are important for determining the wood properties. It's not species alone. It's the growth conditions, how the trees are growing, because they're growing wood according to their own needs. And if their needs change, they will grow wood with different properties. And both species and growth conditions are influenced by nature and by human activity. In the case of species, that's through tree improvement, tree breeding, and so on. And as people like Ben get better at what they do, they have more and more effect on the wood properties. So because properties depend on species, growth conditions, that has certain consequences for what's coming. It means that we cannot rely on data from abroad unless the country is very similar. So Ireland, we can take data, I think, from Ireland and say it would be applicable to the UK, but we couldn't take data from France or Germany or Poland or North America because the growth conditions are different. The climate is different and the forest management is different. And it also means that we can't necessarily rely on old UK data because growth conditions also have changed over time. And because of changes in tree breeding and in forest management, even the well-established species like Sitka spruce are potentially changing in their properties. So properties are always a little bit in flux, and is a difficult thing to capture. But we have to try and capture it. The only way of doing it, especially if you're concerned about strength, is to do destructive testing. And you need quite a lot of testing in order to get that data. I would say you need at least 100 tests before you've even got a basic idea about what the properties are. And that's a relatively expensive and time-consuming process. If you want to really start getting a good idea about what the wood properties are like, you probably have to test maybe 200 boards or more and include more than one growth area. And at this point, you can start to gather information about other important things like the level of variability in the properties, nerdy stuff like the adjustment equations that you need for the properties, likely yields that you might get from grading, but you still don't have enough information to be able to strength grade the timber and use it in construction. to do that, you probably need 500 to maybe 1,500, even 2,000, 3,000 boards to be tested from more than 4 sites around the country, and it needs to be representative of actual production. So you can't really use experimental sites for that, because experimental sites might be different from how the timber would be grown in a future commercial environment. And less usual species require more data because we have less information about how the variability works. And to be able to understand or answer questions like, well, what is the effect of forest management, you need even more data than that. And there are very few species where we've collected that level of data in the UK so far. This is more or less where we are in terms of the level of knowledge. There are 4 species that have been mentioned already today, where we have quite a lot of good information, and they can go into the building industry as well as other uses. As spruce, which is Sitka, and Norway spruce as a mixture. The larches, Douglas fir, and pine. And of these, pine is really, we're relying on quite old data. For the others, the data is relatively new. For pine, we don't have too many options in the system. But Sitka spruce, as many of you know, does grade quite well to C16. C16 is a perfectly adequate grade for building normal buildings. It doesn't really need to be much better than that. So when we're looking at alternative species, probably good to say, well, how well does it compare to spruce? Doesn't need to be much better than the spruce. It just needs to be as good as the spruce. For the other species, noble fir, western red cedar, western hemlock, we have a bit more information, but we don't have enough information yet to be able to actually grade it and use it in construction. And then we've got species, a list where we've started to collect some of the information, and we have a rough idea about how it might grade. And we can say, for example, that, well, Japanese red cedar, it's unlikely that we will get any C16, but species like Pacific silver fir, probably we could. So if you do want to be able to use timber in construction, there are ways of doing it. The main ways are visual strength grading and machine strength grading. If you're doing very specific one-off projects, you might be able to get passed on a certain amount of scientific data, but you'd probably need to be about phase 2 in that, so maybe 200 boards. You can't really do it on the basis of a handful. But the reason I'm showing this slide is because if we want to be able to give routes for visual strength grading and machine strength grading, we also need to collect a lot of data that's relevant to that. We have in the past been collecting quite a lot of information that's relevant to machine strength grading and putting it through machine graders, getting the data that those machines produce. But we haven't in recent years been doing a lot on the visual strength grading side, and we need to be able to do that for a lot of these alternative species, because visual strength grading is the one that is easiest for the industry to adapt. Now, there is very recently, in the last day or two, publication of this latest research note from Forest Research on timber properties with properties of species with potential for wider planting. Principal species are sycamore, silver birch, and grand fir, and secondary species that were covered: Serbian spruce, European silver fir, Pacific silver fir, Japanese red cedar, and we've also got a little bit of data on Northern fir, Caucasian fir in there as well. So that's just out. It's got a lot of useful information. I'm just going to show you one table from it. This is the main summary information about the timber properties relevant to grading. I want to highlight a couple of things. One is that for some of these species, we did some destructive testing and some larger amount of non-destructive testing from a different site. And the properties that you see are quite different potentially between the different sites, and that gets into what I was talking about growth conditions having quite an influence on wood properties, and why I'm usually fairly vague about what the properties are because we don't know them awfully well. And the other thing is the amount of data that we've collected about certain things, and silver birch is definitely the one with the least information that we've collected so far. Only 14 boards that were tested actually made it into the report, because we did at that time struggle to access birch with good form for doing the research. Earlier in the year, there was also a research note about larch, summarising what we know based on work that was done quite a lot by James Ramsey some years ago. And previous to that, in about 2016, there was the report summarising what we knew about noble fir, Norway spruce, western red cedar, and western hemlock. So if you're interested in those, go and find the research notes. Of course, we also did the first one about Sitka spruce. The information is still valid, although we start to collect a bit more information now about what the properties of the improved Sitka are like. Now, it's taken us, as you can see, since 2011 to collect quite a small amount of data about other species. But it does take a long time to collect information, and this is just a timeline of what we know about hardwoods, just to show you how old some of this data is. Some of you might know of this quite famous book that's just known as Lavers, last published in 1983, which has a lot of species listed and a lot of wood properties in there, and actually a lot of the stuff that we've collected for this list of information to feed into this process has come from Lavers, because it's all the data that we have. But it's much older than 1983. Most of it actually was collected by the Forest Products Research Institute between about 1930 and 1950. So it's getting on for almost a century old. And things have changed since then. Growth conditions have changed. But also testing has changed as well. I mean, this was the laboratory where quite a lot of that data was collected. And the standards were also different. So one thing to bear in mind is when you're collecting information about wood properties is you'll get different results depending on whether they're testing clear wood samples or full-size samples and so on. And that's one of the reasons why we came up with this idea of the Sitka index, so that it made it easier to compare properties, so you don't have quite abstract numbers and references to standards, but you could just say, okay, given the test, how does it compare to Sitka spruce? And we are working more on hardwoods now, and that includes some of the mainstream ones that like oak and sweet chestnut, but also ones that we think have some potential, and birch is on the list, and we are collecting more data on birch, which is good. We've also got ash, beech, sycamore, cherry, lime, American red oak, and also a bunch of species that are potentially similar enough to softwoods to be used on the softwood markets, particularly poplar. So ideally, what should the pipeline for research be for this? It's quite difficult actually to get hold of timber from some of these candidate species because there's not a lot of it growing in the UK. So it would be nice to have a system where if something is about to be harvested, something interesting, as scientists get to know about it. And there is an opportunity to do some in-forest measurements, because that's your one and only opportunity to measure stuff on the standing tree. And as the logs get converted, the stuff can still be sold as a product. But there is an opportunity there for the scientists to come in and do some non-destructive measurements on that to collect data. It would be great as well to be able to collect some scientific data for some destructive testing, and to have somewhere where this stuff can be stored and all the logistics around that. And that's one thing that we struggle with right now, is capacity to do that. And then we get the timber graded and tested, and we have this cascade of the material through different processes, so we can collect information about the sawn timber, and we can collect information about fiber and so on, pass it on to different researchers, make the most of the resource that we have, so that we can start to build up the data over time and to get a better picture of this kind of thing, and to do cooperation across the research organizations, because there isn't a lot of capacity to do research in the UK. And the other thing is to develop skills and knowledge amongst the wood scientists as we go through that process. So to get back to our sheep, the main topic of what I'm supposed to be talking about is, well, how do you take all of this and present it in a simple enough way where you can actually start to say, well, which species should we concentrate our work on? And we should really focus, I think, on the main properties that are relevant to the main modern uses that we have. And when I talk about main modern uses, I mean the ones that are commercially important and socially important. And these are properties like strength, appearance, durability. And then there's a bunch of things that are relevant to the producers, like how is it debarked, how difficult it is to dry it, how difficult it is to work with the wood. And there are also a bunch of things that are relevant to the markets, the commercial aspects as well. So are they familiar with it? Have they seen it as imported timber, or does it look strange? Does it look like the wood that they're used to using? And does it appear in the European standards already, as already mentioned? So, as already mentioned at the start of the webinar, there is this technical score, which is to do with the inherent potential of the wood. Not that it should be super brilliant, but that it should be at least as good as Sitka, I would say. And then we've got the economic side, which is the compatibility with the current industry, and the knowledge level also, which is very important, because some of this we know a lot about, and for some species we have no idea about either the technical or the economic side. And in my scoring, I've scored it between 0 and 7. There was a fairly complicated algorithm behind it, but essentially it's a bunch of data that's all put into a big sausage machine that comes then out with a certain score. For the technical side, it's properties like strength, stiffness, and density, the durability, the workability, and the range of existing uses relevant to modern society that have been documented at least somewhere. And there's always scope for improving the technical score through gathering information and through tree improvement and breeding and silviculture and so on. So it's not set in stone. The other thing is the economic side, so how compatible it is with current markets, which would include, I'll explain here what genus and form is. It's just like how familiar it is to the market. Does it look like a fir or a spruce or a whitewood? Yeah, does it look like something that they already know about, even if the species is actually different? And certain existing uses like timber for fencing, timber for pallets, that have relatively low technical requirements. And then the knowledge level, which is just to do with, well, how much data do we have, how much data is informing these scores. And finally, yeah, this is how the stuff scored on my system. Just in case you're interested, this is the same list that you saw at the beginning of the webinar with my 3 scores against it. Now, when I was collecting all this information, I thought, well, okay, likely at some point someone's going to ask me for another species that's not on this list. So I did do also make a bigger list of everything that's been mentioned by someone somewhere in the UK, potentially. And I'll show you that one at the end. But first, some key points to sum up. You don't get high quality wood just by having the trees, which some people seem to be of the opinion that we do. But we also shouldn't be only thinking of high quality timber. There's a lot of stuff that we can make do with, and it just needs to be okay. The other thing is that the homegrown will ever only be a small contribution to the UK's wants, but we still need it nonetheless. It's super important to have it. And if we have the data, we have the options. If we don't have the data, we're kind of in the dark. So the last bit is just my list of all of the species that I've noticed on a list somewhere. So if you do have a favorite species, look out for it as we go through this list here. I was quite surprised, actually, how many things people have tried to grow in the UK before. There's hardly anything that we don't have any data on at all. So yes, I should stop talking at this point. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, that was really fascinating. We're going to move straight on to the next presentation and then have some questions for yourself and the next speaker together, if that's okay. So we're going to hand over now to Dr. Morwenna Spear from the Biocomposite Centre in Bangor, if you're online, Morwenna.
I am, yeah, just making my camera turn on and the screen share and the everything else. Here we go. Different computers doing different stuff. Yeah, great. And I'm glad that Dan's touched on some really useful things there. So hopefully that will come in handy as we go through this. But I figured that at this stage in the afternoon, I might have to jolly you up a bit. We'll see how we get on. The key thing, I think, in the title is that joined up thinking is key to us making some progress. You know, the basket of products that Dan mentioned really comes into play as we look at the industries that work within Wales, or the destination of the timber that we grow in Wales to industries just outside of our borders, whether it's sort of into England or up to Scotland as well. You know, it's quite a tight network, and I mean that in terms of the industries, sawn timber, wood-based panels and other things working hand in hand. So that's how I'm interpreting the importance of thinking about multiple properties and a basket of products. But I thought I'd start with asking what we've got. And this was just a snapshot there taken from the National Forest Inventory for Wales, and it surprised me actually, the balance being so heavily Sitka spruce. I think when I was a student it looked slightly different. We'll pick that up in a second. But even since 1997, which is when the inventory was published, we know that there's been a massive hit to the quantity of larch that we have. So those, you know, slices of pie will have changed slightly, and also some local knowledge here. I'm aware that we've got probably less Corsican pine than we did at the time of this. So forests are a thing that's in flux already. The next question is really, what does our industry want? So obviously start with a nice image, lots and lots of cut product there and lots of logs in the yard. And my first thought really is that we like what we know, and what we know at the moment is spruce. And I'm going to, this is where it gets provocative. I thought that maybe for the sake of argument, I could liken that to sort of pizza and chips, a really kind of heavy meal, you know, not short on calories. It would build you up. It does everything, you know, and actually quite addictive. And it's that element, I think, that I'm talking about, that because we've been used to a fast-grown species that meets all of the needs that we've told ourselves we want, potentially we've become quite accustomed to that way of working. Okay, so just thinking, and this is far less technical than Dan's presentation, and again, I think it's useful at this time of day to take two steps back. Some of the drivers for our love for spruce at the forest industry level, obviously we love the fact it's got a high yield class on upland sites. It solves a lot of the problems that we have in terms of forestry wanting a really good rate of return for the investors, or wanting certainty that our timber is going to reach through to the market. Someone's going to buy it from us at the end of the growth cycle. Okay, It's also, pretty uniform. It's got some knots in it, but we know what we expect because, like Dan said, we've become accustomed to this timber. It's so abundant that we now recognise it. Sometimes in a different forum, I'll find that people say, oh, British timber's absolutely hopeless, and they generally are talking about this exact same thing that we love. We also love to hate the fact that we're sort of used to expecting certain quirky things, distortion and what have you out of it. But let's focus on the positives. One of the things from the mill side that I heard recently is the love of that white colour. It doesn't have a problem with blue stain if you don't dry it. Whereas pine, if you're not careful and get your kind of saw cutting and kiln drying correct, you can have quite a lot of spoilage, and the customer doesn't necessarily want stuff with a bit of blue on it. Even though there's no loss of strength whatsoever, it's just the appearance matters. Okay, so, fairly simple set of criteria that mean that we kind of reinforce this is what we want. It's strong enough, but as we know, it typically is going into a C16 product. So I would venture to say that it's nothing special, which maybe is quite good when you start looking at the table that we saw in the previous presentation of what sort of strength properties we might achieve out of some of these alternative species. But the key thing potentially is this abundance. Because there's plenty of it, we're confident to build an industry around it. And because we build an industry around it, we're happy to continue asking for it because it's what we know and what we're comfortable with. It dries okay, that's fine. I've got treatable with some question marks because, in the textbooks, it's actually not that treatable. But even this attribute, people have come to accept and even ask for. Once upon a time, people might have said, I want pine sapwood because I'm going to be able to treat it really well, and I want to get this product out into a high, risk environment. And so pine sapwood is what I'm going to treat, and I'm going to make a point of difference for my product there. Decreasingly, that occurs. But more and more people say, oh, actually, we like the poor treatability of spruce because it keeps the quantity of chemicals that go into it down. It's a cost-effective treatment. And now that we're allowed to treat it to a certain depth of treatment, rather than the full that it used to say, actually, we're happy to meet that. So even the treatability, we've come to accept the way that spruce is and to start to count that as a negative against pine. But, going back to my pizza and chips analogy, if we were wedded to a thing it's got this mixture of products, it's abundant and it's okay, it's easy to process, how do we possibly move to a more balanced diet where we say, well, actually, these days the forests are producing a whole smorgasbord of different species, different timbers, but I'm going to have to use my brain cells far more in order to actually get something decent out of it. Now, that I can see why there would be quite a lot of resistance, but we've got quite a lot of knowledge about what we used to do, potentially up our sleeves, and we've got quite a lot of technological progress and advancement that's happened in between times. Okay. Just to phrase it again, in case you're wondering what on earth you're doing in a kind of nutrition seminar. Here we go. That's with the correct products in the correct places. But like I mentioned on an early slide, I had this nagging feeling as I was approaching this talk that didn't we used to have a slightly better species balance in Wales? So I dug back into the kind of inventory report and discovered that, coupled with a big swing from conifers to broadleaf in that period, and we are talking 20-something years ago, we've shifted towards more broadleaf. There were substantial reductions in Scots pine, the other pines, the larches, and quite big increases, as you can see in the graph there, in the oak, the beech, the ash, the birch, and the mixed broadleaf. So we've already seen quite a shift in Wales, but it's not gone in the direction that we're talking about today, but we are accustomed to change and actually accustomed to changes in the species mix. And as I've just illustrated, we come to ask for that same thing. Maybe this is a good sign, because maybe it means as we look at these future alternatives, we'll be better able to adapt to it than we kind of grumble about from day to day. So I looked at a recent paper last year, researchers, forest research, but this was in Forestry Journal, and it was a review of the potential alternative species, but this was on the basis of the yield class on different sites, and they'd specifically looked for sites where there was spruce growing in the same place as a alternative species that was worth evaluating. And it was quite interesting reading to me as a wood scientist, just to say, well, which species are starting to come up? In summary, because you've got quite a lot of words there, but I thought I'd pull out some of the key ones. And most of these are already species we're familiar with in Wales anyway. The firs, the abiate species. One of the ones that we're less familiar with is the kind of cypress. But several of the pines we're familiar with, or because they're pines, it wouldn't be a big stretch to start to become familiar with the timber that would come from the emerging species in that category. There's Douglas fir, which actually, coming from North Wales up here, I didn't realise what a minority species it is. It's abundant up here on my doorstep, so I thought it was abundant across Wales. And then Western hemlock, which is a little passion project of mine, because I've always thought it's a species we can be doing much more with. In the kind of more less common species that are in the block at the bottom there, you start to see some extra names, different types of cypress and some alternative spruces as well. I'll let you look that one up if you're interested, but I was wanting to highlight those key groups. Let's click the next slide. We'll take a shift now, and I thought in the interests of keeping things light, I would hop to some projects that we've done before and things that could be promising in the future. So one of the projects, and this is only just under 10 years ago, at the start of the Phytophthora issue, I was involved in a project that was looking at thermal modification for several of the Welsh species. It included some hardwoods as well, but we're less concerned about those today. But we had some good results for larch and western hemlock. And what we actually know is that, it works, the process works, it's been well demonstrated. The key thing is the economics. So I'm pleased even that Dan touched on the economic aspects in his kind of analysis to the end of his presentation just now. In this particular case, you've got to get the right scale of operation, because you need just enough manpower to be able to run the system overnight. To stack it efficiently and so on. So it's probably easier for a medium-sized business than an SME. But we did come up with a very unique system that was suited to micro SMEs, where you've got very low manpower, and that involved kind of stressing the timber maybe slightly more than you should do, but getting a system that would work for a one-man band or a two-man operation. The key thing for me with the economics is the need for stock holding and the duration of treatment. And that often is the bit that's more prohibitive to your micro companies, because they might have relatively small workshop area and small yard facility, whereas a larger business can handle the fact that they have got to hold some stock having treated it before it's sold, or hold some material that they're going to treat next, and get their throughput correct. That kind of economics is really something that people forget to talk about. The other one is the confidence in the market as a person producing it, that there's going to be enough customers to buy this material. How much shall I produce per month, and where's it going to go, and how much will I end up holding because I've got a gap between orders? So again, being slightly larger is better, which is what we've got in the case of the Faston products down in the south of England, that they've been just that better position in order to bring the product to market and weather those uncertainties. But we've shown that imports of thermal treated timber widely accepted. It's carved out a niche for itself in cladding and similarly high value uses. So it's not an impossible technology. It's something we could definitely do. This is a little delve into the historical side of things for those who remember the good old days with Coed Cymru. And the system for TNOS, I just thought, was an example of people have been trying to work out how to do things with some of the less spruce timbers for quite some time. Plenty of work has looked at systems that could be adaptable for the various minor conifers or bring them into a system where it doesn't matter so much. In this particular case, I think TNOS used quite a bit of spruce, but it would be a system that could be adapted to work with some of the other C14, C16 level conifers that have been in the table we saw earlier. Just as an example here, Hiraeth, who's an architecture company, won an award in the Wood Awards very recently for an example of a TNOS house. So these technologies don't disappear just because the research project is finished, is the other thing I wanted to say. Another thing that we've looked at before, and these two, there's a connection to Coed Cymru. People might remember the Welsh angle, which was to look at furniture based on very small dimension but uniform selection of sizes, giving a kind of pattern book so that people could work quite easily. It's a fairly sensible concept, but it's kind of expired now. I think that trademark has now expired as well. But the end grain flooring project I was involved in just on the kind of resin treatment, which is the central image, but lots of the other showcases were untreated or treated with some novel finishes, and the work that came through by Dylan Jones in that project, made itself into some really high profile locations, showing off how Welsh timber with innovative thinking in small dimensions, but in a purpose that is not your regular sawmill output, just allowed small companies to work together towards a valuable product. Now, a little leap sort of around the world, I suppose, there have been other people who've been faced with large quantities of a species that they don't really know what to do with. I thought this was quite a good example for today to get us talking and thinking. Back in the 80s and 90s in the USA, not many people were that interested in using aspen. But if you strand the aspen product and form an engineered composite out of it, you can have a really high quality composite that goes into some of the demanding applications within house building. So that timber strand, I think, that's in the centre there is a good example of that product. And you've got the same sort of thing if you go back another decade in Australia, where they worked with eucalyptus and they were stuck with what to do with this timber that had shake, and it was a bit difficult to mill. They weren't really certain, but Scrimba gave them an opportunity to transform that into an engineered composite and develop a market for it. So I think engineered wood is something that we should be looking to slightly more and maybe have some space to innovate. But the key criterion at the bottom of the slide there is this thing about the benefit of scale. In the case of the USA, you've got multiple states worth of aspen available and a company that's able to draw on a resource across quite a big area. The issue that we will have in Wales as we adopt, alternative species is rustling up enough from one place or another to develop a product for it. I think it's a very different kind of context, and I think that's why the slides in the previous section were so important, just to show that sometimes for the small scale of unusual species in small patches in Wales, it's a different solution that we need. The other option is to play to other strengths that we have, which in this particular case, right on our border, we have a very successful panels company. And I thought, given that they currently produce particle board and MDF and are set to produce OSB at some point fairly soon, maybe this was worth considering too. So In terms of the species we saw from the forest research paper, the emerging conifers, we could look at almost all of those would work for particle board. We would do a little bit of development on the resin side to make sure that the extractives weren't adversely affecting the resin cure to make the board, but I think that that's not really too big of a challenge. If we go to the MDF, I have a suspicion that most of those species would work in MDF as well. They're softwoods. We can look at the kind of cell anatomy and have a fairly good estimate as to how to make the refiner work in order to get good quality fibres out of them in order to make MDF. And again, we'd have to think about the resin and the optimization. But, you know, I think this is not beyond our capability to deliver. And then the third one with the OSB, which again is a material that would like to have sort of virgin log feedstock because of the stranding process. I suspect that most or many of the species in the list from that paper would also slot relatively easily into the OSB manufacture. Oh, if only there was a place that could help you develop this. And this is the small sales pitch. In the Biocomposite Centre, we happen to have a tech transfer centre, which is the only full chip-to-panel solution for doing experiments on MDF, which is why I'm so interested in the refiner stage for looking at those novel conifer species. It could also, our press can also be used to make particle board. We've got drum blenders for resination and so on and so forth. But in the case of MDF, we've actually got the blow line that replicates what happens in industry, whereas the only other plant that I'm aware of in Europe uses a slight kind of fudge in order to resinate their MDF fibre. So it's not quite the same as going through the kind of refiner straight through the resination, drying and pressing that we can do. And then thirdly, we can also use the press for making OSB, and we've got the capability to make strands. So I think that if these species were to, you know, be fast-tracked through at some point, it would be a very interesting thing to do. I'm very nearly there, Gail. We've done various bits of work with the hardwoods, this exact same technology, and I just thought now, by way of conclusions, key things, there are lots of current wood technologies that can be used, can likely be adapted in order to work with the emerging softwood species. Lamination and engineered wood products also been demonstrated. I didn't put the slide in about the CLT and glulam example, but we did think about the stranding. The thermal modification is a fairly easy technology to look at and has already been demonstrated in the case of 2 of our species, but off-the-shelf technologies are available. But the key thing here, we come back to the quality of the timber. We need to be not just growing volume, we need to be thinking about appearance graded, and that's a different set of grading than the visual or the mechanical that Dan has addressed for the joinery applications. So it can't just be that we end up with some timber and say, what should we do with it now? We need to be thinking about the silviculture at the start. There is a much lower likelihood of success with the chemical modification because of treatability. The exception perhaps is fir, which has probably the best option out of those ones in that paper. And not to forget, if we're already moving towards hardwoods for reasons that previous generations of foresters have put into place, we should be thinking just as much about how to do the hardwood management well as we are thinking about which alternative conifer species for the future. So I'd just like to finish there with an email address in case anybody wants to follow up. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for the presentation. There's been a couple of questions going in the chat for Dan on the back of his presentation. Dan, I can see you've answered one. There's one from Neil Stoddart as well. I'm going to roll forward straight on to the next presentation, if that's okay. So thank you very much to both of you for that. We've got Gary Newman now from Wood Knowledge Wales giving us the next presentation. So over to you, Gary.
Can you hear me? And can you see my slide? I suppose is there two key questions.
Yes, to both.
You've got you're one step ahead of me because I can't find my slides. Right, here we are. Well, thanks very much. Excellent presentations. Thank you. I've really enjoyed this afternoon. There's that expression, isn't there? Every day's a school day, but I'd say some school days are better than others. And this has definitely been a good one for me so far. Gail very kindly invited me to speak and also very kindly sort of gave me a reasonable amount of latitude for what I was going to speak about. And I chose what I had on my desk at the time because I thought it would help me to sort of be efficient in my time and the work that I need to do. So I'm going to talk to you about the role of wood in construction as a greenhouse gas removal. I suppose the link to the things that we've been talking about really is that, hey, we're all in the it seems to me we're all a little bit in the business of trying to predict the future with incomplete evidence and changing circumstances, which is a dangerous game, isn't it? But I'm going to throw my hat in the ring for my predictions, and as the need to decarbonize the built environment across the world intensifies, more wood is going to be drawn into the higher value applications such as construction, and I guess in a reducing supply, or at least a constrained supply, then some other markets might struggle, maybe less climate critical or less valuable markets. What knock-on effects that has, I'm not going to try and predict. But anyway, so maybe that's the bit of the link into future species and what properties we should be looking for. And also, I think it was Dave Edwards that said to me, if we grow timber for trees for sawnwood, you can be pretty confident you'll get all the other markets. So there we are. So I kind of like that. So I'll also hold on to that. And I've just put on my timer. So I'll try and keep myself to time. I'm going to talk a little bit about Wood Knowledge Wales, just very briefly, and then go quickly into the main thing, which is the greenhouse gas removals and a little bit of work that I've been doing. So for those of you who don't know, our vision is the transformation of Wales into a socially equitable, high-value forest nation. And our mission is the development of the forest industries from tree to product to benefit the economy, the environment, and the people of Wales. And I would imagine all of us in the room can see the benefits of that. We are an independent organisation. In legal terms, we're a charitable community benefit society. So we're not a charity, we're a co-op, but we're considered charitable for tax purposes. And we're regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority and governed by a voluntary board. And some of you may know our most recent new member on the board, who's at the bottom there, Phil O'Leary. And I know Professor John Healy is also on this Teams. So we're building a cross-disciplinary team of industry and knowledge. Why is that not moving? Membership. So we're at our heart a membership organisation, and apologies to our most recent members because this is now about a month old, and Saint-Gobain Offsite have just joined, and Rhizocore Technologies, and one more. Who is that? They even get named. Woodland Savers. So so there's a few logos missing, but everything from clients to contractors, large, medium, and small, material suppliers, sawmills, forest management, forest owners, architects, all recognizing the potential for increasing the use of timber in construction in terms of climate change mitigation, social value, and economic benefits. So we're a multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary team. Transdisciplinary meaning, in my terms here, meaning that we kind of don't stay siloed in our work. So where we can, we get involved in all sorts of things. From, if it's a forestry thing, it doesn't mean that built environment people don't get involved. And we're a combination of employees and external advisors across both the built environment and natural environment. That's our kind of system, if you like. We're a system change organization. So top left, construction, the use of timber in construction, then the manufacturing, linked to forestry and primary processing, and then doing that in an optimized, resource efficient manner. And if we can do that, then I would say we'll have a thriving forest economy. But you can't do that without societal buying in to what we're talking about, and that is a big piece of work in itself, and that's the wood culture that we need to create. I think the most recent research is suggesting that the number of people that think that trees should never be cut down is growing, and has grown from something like 33% to 37%. So we've got a bit of a problem that needs addressing, and that's certainly within our system. Otherwise, none of the rest can really effectively be achieved. So the greenhouse gas removals work that we're doing is all part of our Homegrown Homes project, and that's basically taking social housing in Wales and using it as a kind of reference to experiment and develop all the other things that we want to see happen to become a high value forest nation, accelerating decarbonisation of the natural and built environments, which isn't to say that all the wood goes into social housing, and isn't to say that social housing is the most important thing. It's just the vehicle that we're using to explore all the issues. And it's a good one because the governments have leverage, and the people that run social housing organisations have a kind of wider social function, which makes them more interested in what we're doing, because what we're doing isn't regulated in terms of, or sorry, demanded by the regulator. So there's a lot of relationship building and nudging. And if I pop back to that, really the work is in the interfaces between the different disciplines, making the connections. That's where the magic happens, not operating in your bubble. And I think going forward to defeat climate change, that's where we all need to start thinking, is what's our role within the system rather than what's my role within this office. Moving on to the subject that I'm going to talk very briefly about is greenhouse gas removals. We've kind of got two in our sphere, which is the growing of trees, which is a natural greenhouse gas removal, and the building of buildings with timber, which is an engineered greenhouse gas removal. And we're working on this project with in collaboration with the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products, and the final report is imminent. It's increasingly going to be my Christmas holiday activity, which is a little bit sad. This is a bit of work I was involved with a few years ago, where they were engaged in the process of predicting the future on the basis of incomplete evidence and knowledge. And I think, they did not a bad job. I was involved, so I can't claim that it's not also down to some of my work, but I lost a few arguments while we were doing it. But you've got the natural greenhouse gas removals at the top, and then you've got the engineered. I presented these at the last forestry event that Gail and Anne organised a few months ago, so I won't dwell on this. But the important takeaways are that both building with wood and planting trees are relatively low cost, technically ready, and of reasonable scale. And yet Ed Miliband has just punted 21 billion into direct air capture, which isn't proven, is very expensive, and isn't going to do much by 2030. And you might ask the question why he did that. And I think really it's much easier to focus on things that don't require any cultural change. It's just another bit of tech that we can believe in. And personally, I don't, even though I think you should put money into it, don't get me wrong. But I'm concerned about believing in any tech, to be honest, in terms of saving the future. I think it's a much more radical thing that we need to do. But nevertheless, yes, so afforestation, land use change, that's pretty tricky, as we're finding out in Wales. And wood in construction goes against a lot of the cultures and regulations and standards and systems and all the things that people are familiar with. So they're both difficult. And actually, I had a chat with Net Zero Industries Wales, and that was pointed out to me because I said, why don't you talk about the natural greenhouse gas removals and wood in construction? And he said, well, yeah, but they're difficult. So I've also produced a spreadsheet to explore how important wood in construction is and could be in social housing in Wales. And the basis for the data of my analysis was the data collected for the English wood strategy by Andy Leach at Comfor. So it hasn't been peer reviewed, as Andy freely admits, and so there needs to be a little bit of that. I'm a little bit more gung-ho than Dave Edwards in terms of presenting my sort of partially finished work. But if anybody wants the spreadsheet and is happy to go through it, then I'd be very happy to share it. So no secrets and nothing precious. But so this is the current situation in Wales. So we've got 3 types of housing: brick and block, which is, you know, in England, it's, I don't know, 70% of all housing. In Wales, I'm not sure now, but in social housing, it's increasingly less common. In fact, I wouldn't be able to point one out in North Wales. Nearly all the social housing that's going up is timber. Then we've got standard timber frame, which what I mean by that is open panel timber frame, synthetic or mineral insulation, a brick external skin, and plastic windows. And I could show you a few of those going up in North Wales. And then in the green, we've got the timber-rich timber frame. And there's actually about 300 of these in various stages of design, planning, construction, or completion within about a 15-mile radius from where I live in Bangor in North Wales. So these are all buildings that are going up. In fact, there's probably more timber-rich timber frame going up in social housing around me than any other type. So they're all real and existent. So you could say it's business as usual, if you like, but I think the current situation is probably a better way to put it. So you can see that the total volume of timber in a brick and block is about 11.4 meters cubed. This is for a 125 square meter house, which is not a typical social housing house. It has to be said, and I'm keen to get different base data, but this is the best we got for the minute. And then if we go to standard timber frame, it more or less doubles. And, you know, this is the reason in a brick and block house, you've still got timber floors, you've still got timber roof, you've still got all the internal joinery, skirtings, and the kitchens and worktops and all of that kind of stuff. So it about doubles if you go to timber frame, and that's really the walls, the open panel walls. So that's your timber studs and also the OSB as your racking board. And then if you go to timber-rich timber frame, where you're starting to use wood fiber insulation, timber windows, and there's another one which I can't remember. Oh yeah, timber cladding. Then the volume goes up to about 28 cubic meters. And from that, you can multiply that up to how much wood we might need. And people always tell me we haven't got enough wood in Wales. And so there's your quantities. If we built all the social houses per year from brick and block, from standard timber frame or timber-rich timber frame. That's also broken down into how much of it's homegrown, how much of it comes from recycled. The recycled is mostly chipboard, and how much comes from imported timber. Then what I did is created a couple of scenarios. What if we had a homegrown timber first policy. And that my imagined policy there is that the timber has to be available. It's just not commonly used. Let's say C16 for a timber stud wall. It is used, and we've got examples of it in houses, social housing around here, but it's not common. So what if we had a homegrown wood first policy? And the other one is, what if we had a homegrown wood first, but we also onshored manufacturing of timber windows, glulam, and wood fiber insulation? And that starts to give you a sense of what the scale of the increase in homegrown timber would be across the three different, the brick and block, the standard timber frame, and the timber rich timber frame. I'm in danger of confusing myself as describing this, but on the left, those three bars were basically the graph of the scenario that I showed you, which was the business as usual. And the other two are the two scenarios. And you can see that I haven't assumed that any more wood would come from the reclaimed timber. So that's all basically the chipboards. It could, and certainly we have a company in Wales developing wood fiber insulation from recycled MDF. So, but I didn't model that in any of these scenarios. We could put a circular scenario in, of course. And essentially you can see that we shift from mostly homegrown to, mostly imported to mostly homegrown. And that will become important when we start to talk about greenhouse gas removals. So just as I've got very little time left, I'm going to move to the biogenic carbon storage element of that. So once you've got your timber quantities, you can then work out how much carbon is stored in that timber. And here you've got the current situation, so what we're currently building. Now, carbon, this is a really dynamic space, but you've got total carbon storage. The word on the street, maybe it's regulatory, maybe it's, I really don't know. There are probably people that could tell me, like Robert Matthews. But the European Union is saying if it's part of the building and its life is more than 35 years, it can be considered a greenhouse gas removal. So that's mostly the fabric. It would exclude, let's say, the kitchens because they don't last that long. So then I've taken that total storage and said, okay, how much of that is stored for over 35 years? And BEIS, in the piece of work that I did, so UK government have said that only timber that's grown in the UK can be considered as a greenhouse gas removal. Sorry. So I'll have to draw this to a conclusion. But you can see that in a brick and block house, almost nothing, let's say 133 cubic meters, 133 kilograms of CO2. Ignore the meters cubed up there, that's wrong. Look at the down the left-hand side. So you start to be able to calculate the actual greenhouse gas removal possibilities. And that's summarized in this final slide, more or less final slide. So the current situation, if you look at the stored for more than 35 years and homegrown, we're talking about 3.6 tons of CO2 in a home as a greenhouse gas removal. But if we move to a scenario where we've specified homegrown homes first and we've onshored manufacturing, then you're talking about up to 21.5 tons of CO2 per home stored as a greenhouse gas removal. I think that's highly significant. So my conclusions, wood in construction can become part of the UK nationally declared contributions in terms of showing how we're meeting our net zero climate change commitments. It's a significant greenhouse gas removal, 3.6 tons per home, the current level. If we had a homegrown first, it would grow to 13.2. And if we started to make the products that we're going to be using, it would be 21.5. We are looking at the policy levers. Should there be private sector offsetting payments? Should it be targets? Should it be mandated? That will be in the report, but that's a discussion for another day. And this is not just going on here, it's going on all over the world. And there are two large organizations, Built by Nature, based out of the Netherlands, and Bauhaus Earth, based in Germany, that are pioneering all the work around these things. Built by Nature, funded by philanthropic foundations, and I'm not sure how Bauhaus Earth is funded, but they've grown from nothing to about 50 employees in about 3 years. So just as a conclusion, I think it's kind of happening. Thank you. Sorry I went over a bit, Gail.
That's great. Thank you very much. Really interesting to see how the work's developing. So we're just going to quickly move on now to our last presentation. So Andrew Wright from Natural Resources Wales is going to give us the last presentation. We may overrun by a few minutes, just to warn you. So let's go.
Thank you, Gail. It should just be loading up now. Hopefully
that's it.
That's come through. Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Yes, I'll try and be brief, knowing the time as well. Just a quick introduction. I'm Andrew Wright. I work for Natural Resources Wales in the land stewardship team. And so following all these presentations all afternoon, I just wanted to just put a little showcase of how NRW are approaching sort of our species diversity across managing sort of the land in our care. I was quite surprised we haven't sort of seen sort of things like this so far. But just a quick reminder from that species diversity that we know that the climate is changing, and this goes to show sort of some of those positive and negative things that the climate is showing. The oak on the left being more suitable going into the future, and Sitka being less suitable in places of Wales going into the future as well. So I just thought I'd show those sort of positives, depending on your perspective, positives and negatives of the climate change. That we've got to start really considering what it is that we do on the ground. But I think when we adapt when we think about adapting the land in our care, we've got to sort of species diversity is part of these things. There's a lot of risks that we've got to contend with, and this weekend has shown some of those risks in the last couple of weekends in really magnified examples. Wind, Storm Dara, Storm Bert have shown the impacts of the risks to the people who manage land. 2023 also showed that wildfire is a big risk to us as well. This year as well, we had the first interception of Ips typographus within Wales. So again, pests and diseases are knocking on our door. We've got to be really wary of some of these things. 2023 also showed some potential impacts with drought, and we've seen flooding and waterlogging. And frost is a big issue, sort of the unseasonal frosts as well. So site suitability has to take into account all of these risks and on what it is that we choose to go on our estate. I thought to start with just a quick reminder of the basics, that in changing the land, we've got the standards that we have to use. We have to follow UK Forestry Standard with its sort of definitions as well. We also, that reminder, NRW, along with Forestry England, Forestry Land Scotland, the longest certified state forest in the world. So we have to follow UCWOS criteria as well. And it was mentioned earlier, the UK Forestry Standard Practice Guide for Adapting Woodland Management is a very useful tool as well, just to give us those basic sort of structure about where it is that we go. But I thought we have to use sort of, or we don't have to, but we use a range of tools that can help make those decisions. And I thought I'd just highlight one of those tools. Obviously, there's already been mentioned things like ESC as well, but Forest Research's climate matching tool as well provides sort of a good little indication of where it is we're going. So I've just chosen on this screen, I've just chosen a site in mid Wales, a random site. It may be a forest, it may not be a forest. And this is just showing that the equivalent of the same conditions that we've got in that site in mid Wales, where else is that those conditions replicated today? And that shows a little bit of sort of northwest France and into the sort of the Low Countries, maybe sort of similar, but not 100% similar. But as you go through the decades, 2030, you start seeing that becoming more similar to the current climate that we've got here in Wales. As our climate starts changing, and that sort of starts increasing. So you get to 2060, and a lot of Europe, Central Europe, the lowlands, and Brittany are similar. Our climate will be similar to what they've currently got as well. So those are things, sort of just that reminder of the potential implications that we've got to think about when we do our planning as well. So when we think about sort of the resilience that we have to do, species diversity is just one of those things that we've got to factor in. And we've got to remember sort of species diversity when we start thinking about that. Do we put 10% of every species going in there and just have it even? No, we've got to think about sort of the scale. So species diversity, if we make those scales too big, are we just creating another monoculture of a different species? If we create them too small, are they becoming too difficult to manage as well? So we've got to get that balance right on scale, but we shouldn't underestimate the mixture element as well. So we want to sort of think about the mixtures. Do we want to have blocky mixtures? Do we want to have intimate mixtures? A lot of these things have been learned in the past, but I think sometimes we've got to relearn them, but relearn them for modern climates as well. Already been mentioned, I think a couple of times this afternoon, we should be thinking about the provenance. But along with, and I think this has also been mentioned, along with those species diversity, we've got to think of the structure, the silviculture that we want. Why are we planting those trees in the first place? Is it purely to say that we're diverse, or have they got a function? And thinning is a big part of our forest resilience planning going forward into the future as well. We should be getting in earlier than ever before to start our thinning as well. So I just wanted to know, yeah, what are we doing? How do we do it? So this has been a few years now, and I'm bearing in mind Dave Edwards' presentation. So we've got these practice guides that were developed about 8 years ago now. For forest resilience. So one's on sort of diversity, species diversity, one's on structural diversity, and one's on the genetic diversity. And they're a few years old. They still hold today, although maybe in need of an update in light of some of the work that's being done. So our approach is at the planning stage. We've changed our focus from looking at solely at all that fell on restock and what we're going to restock. Because when we're planning our forest, we're looking at up to sort of 20 years in the future. And I think it's unfair for a planner to start thinking, right, actually, I'm going to put Sitka spruce or lime or whatever it may be in this forest. And we haven't even thought about what's under there until we felled it. And the experts on the ground are those that manage the sites more carefully. So what we come up with is forest types. And I noted in the chat earlier there was mention of forest development types. It's not forest development types, this is our future forest types. So in this example we've got here, we've just sort of the purple and the blue are the two key predominant ones, and we're looking at upland Wales, either high exposure or low exposure. So we just come up with that sort of forest type that sort of says, yeah, that's what we're looking for in the future. We're going to manage that as an upland forest high exposure site, and that sets the sort of the overall parameters and direction of where that's going, but doesn't sort of go to the detail of saying exactly what's going to go in there at this stage. But then what we've got in those practice guides that we saw, so in the upland exposed site, we come up with some information that, again, these are just tools as well. I stress tools and guidance because I hate forestry by numbers. That's what we have experts managing the sites for. But this gives some ideas for managers to consider when doing their restocking. We go into sort of the soil types. Do they want to plant broadleaves? Do they want to plant conifers? And then a bit more information in the document about if they're planting mixtures, what type of mixtures they should be thinking about as well. And that just gives those basic sort of pointers to people to start planning their sites. And then as they sort of start thinking about that, they can then start doing their own plans. This is after, or not after necessarily after, but closer to the time of felling, they'll start thinking about the restocking. So you could come up with a plan then. This is just an ad hoc plan that's been drafted as a sort of a mock example. So you could come up with a plan that just says, actually, we're going to put Douglas fir over here, we're going to put Wellingtonias over there, Norway spruce here, and some red oak over there. That's just a typical sort of just an example, a mock example of what we'd do. But that would be based on the sort of species that's been highlighted in those forest types as well. So how are we managing on achieving this? So what I've put up here, and please excuse the colors here because the system wasn't working for the matching two different tables here. The bulk of this graph that you're showing here is just a graph of emerging species that we planted over sort of the last 10 years. And it shows quite clearly that we had a bit of a peak in 2016. So we're planting quite a bit. There was quite a bit of Serbian spruce planted during that time. But then we started to drop off on our sort of species, but there are a number of factors, a number of reasons for that that we don't need to go into. But what I've put on the right hand side on the same scale is what our aspirations for the 24-25 planting season. So those emerging species, what are we hoping to plant this coming season? Now, we heard from Ben earlier about the nurseries, the issues with nurseries, and how the challenges they have. So it's important that our aspirations are that we have to sort of work closely with others to achieve those aspirations as well. So that's linked to ensuring that our restocking, our ground prep is done timely. We've got the contractors to do it. The species are available from the nurseries and all of those type things. But if all goes well, we will be increasing our sort of planting of those emerging species. So that was a very quick run through. I speeded that up a bit with the time. Quick run through of what it is we're doing. And I'm conscious that we've got quite a few people here from NRW who are actually the people doing that as well. So they'll know a lot better than I will of what we're doing. But that's a run through of sort of that approach that we take and how we do it as well. So my sort of summary of what it is that we do is straightforward. It's we are increasing our focus on sort of species diversity. Some of it emerging, some of it just the known species. It's important that we put the right tree in the right place for the right reason. Some of the things that sort of come to mind, I'm thinking with the weekend we've just had, perhaps some more sort of different species that are going to be more wind firm, that would withstand sort of the events we've had recently. In some of the South Wales valleys, greater strips of fire belts, broadleaf fire belts as well. So it's understanding why we're planting, what's the reasons for those trees going there. We need to sort of work closely with the suppliers for our trees, let them know in advance what it is that we're thinking about planting, and start really getting those ready to go when we need them as well. And also, from our NRW's perspective, we've got a range of sort of staff. So it's increasing the skill levels within our own teams to give them more confidence to utilise some of these species. Because some of the species, as mentioned by David Edwards, the establishment is a little bit more difficult. You plant Sitka and it grows, I always say, either to spite foresters or in spite of foresters or whatever, but Sitka grows. But some of these other ones take a bit more work in the establishment. So we are working with sort of just trying to upskill some of the staff, although we've got some staff that are very well experienced as well. And there is both value and challenges in species diversity across the state. And the other bit I would just say is what we should be doing going forward is taking on board some of the stuff that's been done across other areas, the work that's been done in Scotland, and considering whether we update our forest type sort of details to reflect that as well. That's as far as I was going to go today there, Gail. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Andy. That was really, really interesting to round things off, and thank you for that perspective. So thanks to everybody for coming along today. We've had a really good number of people in this session. There's a couple of late questions that have just gone into the chat, but I'm afraid we're really out of time now, but we'll make sure that we do get answers to those that have asked those questions last minute or made comments. So thank you so much, especially Tom Jenkins. You are a legend by putting all of these different links into the chat for us to follow up afterwards to see all of the useful research and information that's available. Absolutely sterling job. And thank you to David Edwards for helping to coordinate the presenters and for really getting this agenda together with us. So thanks to all our speakers and to everyone who's input in the chat and to everyone for being here. We're going to be coming out to consultation on the 31st of January of next year on the timber industrial strategy. And so that will be a written consultation that will be open for 12 weeks. So we'll be keen to be engaging with stakeholders using stakeholder engagement events throughout the 12-week period. So more of that in the new year. And we'll be running more of these events as well, because Welsh Government, we want to put on a series, as Naomi said at the beginning, of events, conferences, workshops, in the forest workshops over the next 12 months. So thank you so much to everybody. Have a wonderful and safe festive season, and we'll see you in the new year. Diolch yn fawr iawn. We'll send a copy of the presentation slides and the recording to everyone who registered. Thank you very much.